Welcome to another podcast called Local Government Matters. And today we are discussing the formative years of democratic local government, the transition from apartheid to democratic local governance from the perspective of a political leader is what we are doing today. What did it take to build local institutions from scratch amongst high expectations and limited resources? Understanding the early hopes and compromises that shaped South Africa's governance DNA. We are again very fortunate to have the Chisa Tsanole, a veteran of the democratic transition, both during the negotiations, but also as a deputy minister and later a minister, as well as the deputy speaker of the South African Parliament. So he's been around from the time of the struggle to right up to the present, in a sense. And so he is perfectly suited to have this conversation about the formative years of democratic local government with Johan. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you. Good day. It's great to chat with you again. It's great talking to one of the heroes, as far as I'm concerned, of the local government system.
Thank you very much, Johan. Thank you for the opportunity to both.
I remember vividly meeting up with yourself in 1995 in August in Parliament, bright-eyed, 30-year-old lawyer, and my job was to be a researcher for the chair, the late Praveen. I remember your background coming from Sanko, playing a significant role there, also your role in the pre-interim phase. So from your perspective, can you give us an idea of the transition from apartheid to democratic local governance? Or what it took to build the local institutions from scratch amid high expectations and limited resources, those early hopes and the compromises that shaped our government. If you can just hear your perspective on that, please.
I think what you have described is an interesting starting point, but there are even earlier points that are significant factor into our discussions here. One of them is that I come from Bloemfontein in Mangaung, and one of the townships in Mangaung is called Bart location. Now, when this township was created, we are told Brown Fisher was one of the outspoken critics of the decision to allocate places for staying of Africans across the railway line away from where they were staying. And he was objecting to it on the grounds that these people that you want to divide away from us are the ones who contributed to building the economy that we do have right now. And I think that's a very important foundation for what now is Chapter 8, National Development Plan, the spatial planning justice that we need. It's an important story because it also informed many of the municipalities. These municipalities that took place were fighting against injustice on the basis of divisions that were created by where the racial divisions and the consequential economic and other discriminatory practices that were unacceptable to the majority of people at the time. And so it's an important story to tell. The second point I want to raise about it is that going towards the many national elections in the country, we had a reconstruction and development plan. And when we did that, I was coming in there and participated in the contributions as part of a collective representing civic structures in the reconstruction and development plan. In other words, we had a very specific idea of what needed to be done to redevelop our country against the damage done by apartheid. And I think it is also important to point out that negotiations that took place actually first took place in the ministry councils where civic structures fought heated battles politically, especially, but also in other forms of as well, in order to create what we call one city, one tax base at that time, as the plan we were making. But importantly, it was important to remember that uh, those negotiations were supported by what we call the urban sector network. This was a network of NGOs that were progressive, operated in the country, supporting many of the municipalities in their crafting potential alternatives to what was happening at that time. I think it is important to acknowledge their contribution. It is not only in the local government sphere, but it was also, for example, in what came to be known as the people's housing process, where people's dialogue, an NGO that was small, but supported people with the creation of their own housing in ways that they prepared and wanted to see happening. These supportive networks of NGOs is an important story that needs to be told. I think this is why it is so unfair that when you watch the negotiations documentaries, it's claim I always say that is missing on the local government negotiations. In other words, the story that needed to be told about municipal struggles across the country, and then of course the negotiations that they initiated and building on the additional negotiations were also already being planned and worked on. But the starting point in terms of what happened first was in the municipal areas. Those were bodies that were intended to ensure that the work that we do once we enter the municipal sphere, do so having been informed by what we think ought to be in the manner in which local government is going to operate. And we realized that we could not ourselves bring together effective that area of work without the national environment, national provision, and local environment having been knitted together well enough to give us space to do that. This is where what you refer to as the interim, the work that was done. I co-chaired the local government negotiations forum of the negotiations. I co-chaired that forum with a guy called Magda of the National Party. So the proposals happening in local government in the negotiations was went through that structure to inform the national negotiations themselves. It is an important story worth telling properly at a later because in its absence, perspective of governance is misrepresented at that stage. In other words, by not being there, you do not get sufficient background to some of the matters that pushed us into taking positions. I was asked by some of our friends to go and speak at a local government elections for elections meeting, the workshop conference in Mozambique at Edward Mudlane University, where they had just finished research on local government and on elections generally in the country and wanted to present it for debate and discussions. So we were thought that we might provide an emerging reality in the neighborhood about our three-step process of moving towards final local government elections. That was a very important part of the story that we did. In other words, we were already at that time operating internationally, having received some of our perspective from interacting with the, for example, Commonwealth Local Government Forum, International Association of Local Authorities. We met in Windhoek, in Harare, and in other places in order to get the information and input into the work we are doing to all these platforms that I'm talking about. This movement itself, interacting as Senate, supported by the NGO sector, was the framing of the input into the nature of democracy that we would like to do for our country. And as I said at the last discussions, that we clamored for and called for genuine democratic governance, which are about to introduce in its late life in the 80s was not what we are going to accept. So what must come in must be proper, genuine local democracy with strong involvement of people in the work that gets done.
If I can get in there, Letitia, because that is a critical component, the democratization of government at the local level. In that period, the pre-interim phase, and also prior to that in the 80s, there was a highly charged political atmosphere, especially in relation to local government. Most of the fighting place at that level, infrastructure and so on being targeted. The political atmosphere was charged against the local government as it was then. Yet there was a new dispensation, the national vision of transformation, working together with the previous apartheid masters. Can you recall the first moment that you felt the weight of this democratic project? Because it had to work at local level, where it was the most contested. Lechesa?
But in the first place, the campaigns that were fought on the ground about resources generated by people, African people, colored people, Indian people, and everybody else in different ways to areas that, strictly speaking, they ought to come together, was the fueling of the conflict that can generate resources, and these are discriminatedly only allocated to areas largely, in the majority of instances, to white areas. It was incorrect to deal with them that way. That was in the first place. But also importantly, interaction between the national struggle against apartheid and its local manifestations also meant that the manner in which resources were distributed by national government to be distributed unfairly in an unjust manner was the problem that led to the levels of poverty in the townships, the poor educational facilities, including for children, but also for places of work, and the absence of training programs in places of work that will enable workers not only to acquire more education, but also to be able to access opportunities for doing jobs for which they had experience, but were prevented from exercising them because of the color of their skin. So those discriminatory practices, including of allocation of resources to prevent a fair and visible product of progress on the ground, was what fueled campaigns against arbitrary local governance. The municipal officials of the old authorities became unable to manage as they used to do in the past. Areas in which many civil structures were now operating very strongly and created difficult conditions for these authorities to operate there. This is part of what broke the back of resistance against change that was being demanded. You talk about infrastructure and related issues. For example, I am aware of the promotion of beer halls in African townships in order to finance local authorities, became targets for opposition by ourselves on the ground. People even long before us. There are some people who get to protest against such ridiculous reason for financing municipal structures that were only designed for black people. Objections to those processes were key towards influencing and fuel the direction of resources to all municipalities, irrespective of and what they want to.
I think when it comes to the new system being conceptualized, there must have been some very difficult decisions or compromises that one would have to make. I can think of a few. The retention of staff, for example, or traditional leadership and the role that they are playing. What were some of those most difficult decisions, firstly? And secondly, how were communities included or even left out during the formation of democratic local institutions?
In the majority of instances, Johan, we used to receive criticism from others who questioned our legitimacy as genuine representative of people. And we used to dare them and challenge them. Go to the townships where you think we are not fully represented so that you are able to persuade people otherwise. They knew they couldn't and they never did, precisely because this was what was happening. Firstly, the legitimacy of the representativeness of the civic structures. They were never able to demonstrate any position otherwise. So we were able to put pressure on them to recognize that civics had great legitimacy and were tested in many instances. Of course, there were always difficulties in the work with traditional leaders, working with communities where civic structures also existed. But one of the things that is important that we should state in the advice we got from others who had already been independent before us, such as in Zimbabwe. My first hearing of a Swahili phrase was when the principal of the local government institute in Zimbabwe at that stage said to us, Haraka haina baraka. Rush has no. He was saying to us, we must be careful that we might be tempted to kick out white officials who are running municipalities. And when we have not as yet built the necessary capacities, that we must be cautious, that we must lead them effectively, so that finally, when we do that, we are able to effectively take over. The work with traditional leaders was in the systems that would be necessary for the collaboration of the elected representatives and traditional communities that were led differently. So it was the arrangement around those systems that were important, though tough and difficult to manage over a period of time as well.
If we move on to,
Can I just make one important point? I think
okay, please go ahead.
one of the things that began to emerge at that time, the transition between where the old order system was kicked out and the transitional system was placed in operation. In other words, having the former so-called statutory representatives of municipalities and non-statutory people, meaning those of us from civic and other non-establishment forces. That was a very important stepping stone towards democratizing the system to ensure that the interests that came from the non-statutory sector, for example, was fairly and justifiably represented in the decisions of managing the areas on an ongoing basis until we reached a later position when we would have said that we are now ready for that. So it was an important step that was taken, and in defining in defining that step, it was precisely because we realized that we couldn't just let governance structures collapse. We needed these interim structures to provide a foundation for working together between our aspirations for what we would like to see with the experience of those who had some experience, although racially discriminated against and so on.
Thank you. If you go on to the next segment, we'll be looking at governance as an evolving practice. Can you share with us whether there were moments that you saw this new local government system as truly working, as delivering, healing, and rebuilding? That on the one hand, early warning signs that certain parts of the model were not sustainable. Maybe how the districts work, or how planning works, and public participation. If I can get your views on that.
Well, firstly, one of the things that was important was in getting a public representative to get used to working in a manner that engages people effectively. We from the civics had created a culture in communities that no decisions must be done without our involvement, nothing without us, about us without us, as the GPSA came to talk about, the Disabled People's Organization, that nothing should be agreed upon without our involvement. So those moments were very difficult because the others were not used to that experience. They were used to making decisions and announcing them, and on the grounds of their so-called authority, those would be accepted as such, which was not going to be the case. And in many instances, there were conflicts arising from decisions made there. We had a number of crossing, having to block decisions and then subsequently following up. It was an important struggle to persuade the old order officials, so to speak, to accept democracy as we brought to their attention at that time. We ourselves needed to appreciate dynamics of governance and structures that were in place so that there is cooperation across the board where appropriate in the interests of the people, the majority of the people, including in those areas that were not necessary, that were there in the old order. They too were not always used to democratic running of municipalities. Residents generally gave them the authority because they knew they acted on their behalf. And so actual democratic engagement was not always on the agenda.
You were in a number of positions. I think Ashraf has indicated you were in Parliament, in the National Assembly, also in the NCOP. You were also an MEC in the Free State for local government and a Deputy Minister Cocta. How, in your view, did relationships between the national, province and the local sphere evolve during that period?
Yeah, good way to use because I think it was an important platform, understanding the framework of the necessity for collaboration between the local sphere, the district level, as well as the provincial sphere, working together with various departments and so on to do work there. It created meetings of what were they called now?
I talk about the
That-
MINMIX,
The MINMAX, yes, minister and MC
MEC.
from different provinces. Involved a lot of debate around how cooperation is working out. And this particular framing was in the requirements for support for local municipalities, both legislative and in other ways of doing those. Section 154 of the Constitution, essentially, with the one, Section 139, that came to be the dominant one, being the one that gets the most attention and not as much as is required of the Section 154. I think some of provincial departments had very weak provincial departments and could not sufficiently provide the support they were expected to carry out to municipalities. That was part of the biggest problem that confronted. Of course, the formation of the local government associations, SALGA, and its provincial structures also had a similar problem in the intervening period of their establishment and beginning to map out how they were going to work to support each other's municipalities operating at a provincial level with a provincial department also required debate and contentious relationships along the way. So that evolution is referred to includes building these relationships and then managing them along the way, a path that was not there before, creating tensions along the way. But it was a crucial tension because it opened our eyes in amongst other ways, and also opened up opportunity for creativity. Those of us who were fortunate to have been in legislature between 94 and 99, we had a very strong appreciation of the debates that went along putting together, firstly of the Demarcation Act, for example, and its debate and discussion, and subsequently the legislation that put into place the systems and the structures and the Intergovernmental Relations Act. Those were very important debate and discussions that took place before the passing of that legislation, including the Intergovernmental Relations Act, because it needed to be appreciated about what is the basis for provincial and municipalities and the nature of that relationship. and struggling around the authority that each had needed to exercise properly and effectively. So one of the biggest challenges was that the relationship economically, for example, between metropolitan areas that already existed there. And some of the sources of the work they had to do economically source their goods and things. It's an important part of that story.
If we were to look back, the chaser, with a view of learning as we are going forward, if you could redo or reconceptualize one part of this foundational period, what would that be? And secondly, what are the major lessons that today's officials, people like I'm also one of those officials and councillors, should inherit from your generation?
I think an appropriate appreciation, I think we must not underestimate, there has been a huge turnover. I was asked a question in Parliament some time back. We held meetings with media, and they wanted to know what is the difference between Parliament because during the 2000 the, uh, 15th Parliament, they wanted to know when we compare it with the previous first Parliament and so on. And I pointed out to them that it's the same that you see in the media. We have had a turnover of experienced leadership. And that has implications for the quality of what gets done. Capacity is unfortunately diminished along the way. There are limited experienced people who remain in the system for some reason. We don't have a good balance of continuity and change as has to happen on the basis of democracy. So this is the sort of challenges that we face there during that period. What we are asking is that we need to pay a better quality of attention to the capacity building and training of both officials and public representatives. That quality capacity building is necessary for purposes of capacity. Some of the frameworks that we adopted remain valid today, and I think they can best work out better with better quality of training and capacity building so that you don't have too vast a difference between the remaining experienced few councillors and officials and the vast majority of others who do not have sufficient capacity and are not able to provide good leadership and guidance as a result. For me, that's what needs to be focused on. Quality of people that we invite to join us in becoming our public representative, the quality of their induction and training inside their organization, come to operate as public representatives, no, as officials inside municipalities, including at other levels. It is important that they come in appreciating the overall legislative environment in which they are being asked to perform and to perform it to the best of their ability. Give institutional grounding. They are likely to be the source of conflict inside the structures of governance at a political and at the administrative level, seeking solutions that may have been tried and or may just be known to be problematic in their implementation. And so it is a wide spectrum of issues that require capacity in a big way. And a transformative appreciation and understanding of the economy. If you look at the quality of work that's been done to bring about difference inside municipalities, we don't often see sufficiently. There are elements that remain from the past of a broader, collectively devised economic visions of some of these municipalities and what could be done to lay the foundation for successful transformation. But you don't see enough of that any longer. There is insufficient long-term thinking in the implementation of programs that are designed that they make the biggest impact. For me, that long-term thinking is an important one, including continuity and change in the capacity building that we do. It's absolutely crucial that we notice those.
I can't agree with you more. And in that same vein, whether one is a politician, an administrator, what in your view makes up ethical leadership now? What does it look like now in an era of distrust and of governance fatigue?
My attitude is that we need a, a friend of mine called me from somewhere else saying to me, hey, by the way, we must not make the mistake of assuming that people do not know the difference between what is wrong and what is right, and that we can play games around with it. People are going to see what we do that is wrong, and they'll take us to task for that. And sometimes it will not be present the manner in which they do it. Ethics and integrity. We would like them to happen, obviously, from within our families. That's where the guidance needs to start. But equally, the environment within which we grow up in itself must be influential to us in our families, in the neighborhoods that we come from, so that integrity is not something that can right now we have a youth to push back on the level of, let me call it criminality and corruption that is very unacceptable. And it's not going to be easy to deal with that. There are some who have now defined success in their view of what happens when you enter administration and or the political field of in a problematic manner. So we have a big challenge to turn that around big time. And we can do it neighborhood by neighborhood, ward committee by ward committee, councillor by councillor, so that every one of us who acts with discipline in a manner that is ethical and is able to call out when things go wrong urgently and act swiftly to protect it becomes exemplary. It's a big national campaign that our country needs badly at the moment that we are speaking to you about these matters now.
Thanks. And then lastly, at a personal level, as you are now reflecting, what has your journey taught you about leadership, about humility, and about service on the one hand? And then secondly, what gives you hope that local government can still be reformed and renewed?
Reflecting personally, I think our teaching in the struggle, observing and hearing from those who were there before us. They are very inspiring stories that I can talk about later. The necessity to serve, the necessity to do things because we want others to benefit, who otherwise on their own will find it difficult to benefit from processes that they ought to be having access to. So it is my own civic political history that I learned this lesson that I'm talking about. And I think we need to find ways to share these with as many companies as possible. Some of the stories that we got to hear about such acts are unbelievable today because others assume that to act with integrity under all circumstances, even when no one else is watching you, is a difficult problem and so on. So I think I was reflecting on my personal reflection on that matter, but also on the national municipal agenda item to communicate clean governance in our country, not only in the eyes of our own people, which is the principal reason. And then secondly, also so that even in who we interact with and how we interact with them outside of our own country, we come to be known as people with integrity. That under no circumstances should we be one thing on the one hand and another in different circumstances, but that we should consistently, in front of the eyes of the people that we lead in our own community and country, but also in our interaction with others elsewhere, so that when we tell the drums of this world to go jump, it is because of integrity and ethics that we were taught where we grew up. And we insist on those being appropriate values. It is important that we do that.
Thank you very much, Lechesa. I do want to echo what gives us the hope that local government can be reformed, can be renewed, is an emphasis on integrity and on servant leadership, of doing it for a greater cause. I want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the time that you have given to us for this podcast, but also for the time that you have spent since forever and still involved in local government.
Thank you much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Ashna. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating conversation. You know, Leticia, on a personal note, you were my leader in the 1980s and you continue to be my leader today, and an inspiring one. You are a true elder in our community. You echo the integrity that informed our local government system. We want to consult our people. There must be democracy. There must be accountability and things. And your lament that we need to get back to that is in fact the challenge, is in fact what we are trying to do with this book and this podcast series, to tell young people, look, it is possible. There was a vision, that vision hasn't changed. And so thank you for reminding us about that. And I really appreciate it. You clearly have a lot in your head, and I hope you continue to write. And that gunpowder green tea that keeps you young continues to keep you young. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. All the
Bye.
best.